often said that when you gather a group of National Park Service rangers around a campfire, you're liable to hear all kinds of stories. Hi, I'm Ranger Chuck Arney with National Park Service here in the John H. Chafee Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. You know, National Park Service has a long tradition of ranger campfire programs. You can find them up at Acadia National Park in Maine, all the way down to the Great Smokies in the North Carolina, Tennessee, even out to the far campgrounds out west. When you go camping in a national park, most likely you're going to find a ranger with a campfire. Now here in the Blackstone Valley, we don't have any camping facilities, so we thought we'd get all the rangers to sit around here and share some of their favorite stories. Now they kind of run the gamut of human emotion, from poignant and sad stories to some with humor, some outright bizarre. But anyhow, we're going to share our favorite stories of the Blackstone Valley with you today. Well, I tell you folks, there's nothing like a good music to make a campfire extra special. Now, the first story we're going to tell is probably a story you've heard before, because after all, everybody knows that Betty the elephant was shot. At least I think you all know. But you've never heard this story told this way. Now, Dan, why don't you tell a story about Betty the Chepachet elephant?
So lots of people in the Blackstone Valley know the story of Betty and how Betty the learned elephant died in Chepachet, Rhode Island. It's a very sad story, and we tend to focus a lot on the tragedy of Betty's death. But I've gotten thinking more and more about the fact that we ought to celebrate Betty's life and all the unique things that Betty could do and what her life was like with her family. And probably one of the best places to find out what her life was like was to visit an elephant that's living here in the Blackstone Valley. Elephants that live over at the Southwick Zoo in Mendon, Massachusetts. It's right here in the Blackstone. We can head on over and talk to the keeper, visit with the elephants, and find out what Betty's life must have been like when she was here in the valley back in the 1820s. We're here in Mendon, Massachusetts at Southwick Zoo, and we're here with Chris Hamblin. He's an elephant keeper. And Chris, I have some questions for you, and hopefully these questions will help shed some light on Betty and her keeper, about what life was like in 1822 as an elephant keeper and as Betty. So I was wondering, first off, I should ask you a basic question, and that is whether Betty was an Asian elephant or an African elephant, based on the broadside that we have.
Well, based on the broadside and based on the fact that it was a date, she was definitely an Asian elephant. They didn't really start importing African elephants until the the early 1970s. So up until then, African elephants were actually considered untrainable.
And the broadside says that Betty was 12 years old, so does that mean she was an adult?
No, she was still a kid. They're not full grown into their late 20s, and they'll live into their 70s or 80s. Actually, Judy here, she's about 57 years of age. I'm sure that he either bought it from possibly a circus or from an animal importer of some sort, and most likely he bought her when she was very young, maybe 2 years of age or so. And I don't know, maybe he possibly trained her, maybe he had somebody else train her, but most likely back then he probably trained her himself. Mm-hmm. Which then she'd probably have him about 10 years or so. So it sounded like he kind of knew what he was doing.
Yeah. But a lot of people imagine that the keeper and Betty were traveling with a circus, but actually there was just the two of them. They would walk from town to town throughout the Blackstone Valley, or probably throughout New England. And so what was that? What would that have been like? What kind of relationship would the keeper have had with Betty?
It would have been. It was a 24-hour relationship. I mean, these guys are very, very intelligent, and they're very social animals. So in order for them to really work with you and do it well for an extended period of time, they really need to have your trust, and they really need to have a really solid relationship with you. You're constantly taking them into new places they're unfamiliar with, and so you kind of have to ease them into those places. They have to trust you to be able to go into a new building, a new tent.
And this would have been the same in 1822.
Yeah, it would have been the same.
Can you imagine, suppose you're walking
Judy,
to Chepachet from, let's say, from Mendon. What would that have been like? Would you have ridden on Betty?
Most likely you would have ridden on her, and back then you can't, obviously transport your own hay, so a lot of that time would have been spent grazing. Grass fields, trees, and kind of walking as you're grazing. And so she would have gotten the diet that she needed, and at the same time they would have gotten to where they needed to go. Judy, come on, we're over here, back up.
And what about when it was time to sleep at night? How would the keeper have done that most likely?
The norm was back then is they'd just tie a rope around their own foot and then tie a rope to the elephant's foot, and the elephant would sleep there. The keeper would sleep somewhere around the elephant, most likely under the elephant. And so if the elephant started to wander off, it would obviously have woken up the keeper.
Oh, yeah.
And so after a while, then the elephant just knows that at that time it's just time to sleep, and they would sleep.
Yeah. Now, at a show, Betty would have been around a whole lot of people she had never met before. What would the keeper have, well, first off, how would Betty have felt about other people all around her?
Most likely she would have, they would have been probably a source of treats to her, and she probably wouldn't have been cautious or on the defensive with them as long as the keeper was there. Because, like I said, the relationship takes on one of that of a parent, to where the elephant understands as long as the keeper's there, there's nothing that's really going to harm them. And that's where a lot of the trust is built up.
Oh, yeah. Now, the man who had Betty shot was kicked out of the I don't want to call it the circus, but he was kicked out of the
Judy, back up.
The tent or the ring wherever Betty was being shown. So the keeper obviously cared enough about Betty to kick someone out who was being disruptive.
Oh, yeah.
He hired some assassins to have Betty shot. And what would that have been like? Would the keeper have been, obviously would have been with Betty at the time that happened?
Yeah, that would have been probably an elephant keeper's worst nightmare, essentially.
And he probably would have been
Judy,
riding on Betty or walking beside Betty?
Probably once they got into town, he walked next to her, just so he can control more of the crowd that would approach the elephant. So he's probably walking, if it happened in a town, he's probably walking next to her at that point. And, I mean, the relationship is unlike one you'd have with your child, so if you can imagine what that would have been like, probably would have been very traumatic for him.
In the broadside, it says that Betty could do a lot of the same tricks that I noticed that you do here at Southwick Zoo. When I watched the show,
Yeah.
It was like, oh yeah, I recognize those things because they were the same things as in the broadside. What about another trick that she could do was she could pick up a bottle and take the cork out of it.
Yeah, that would be very easy to train. You just simply put something in the bottle that they like.
Oh yeah.
And if they're kind of mischievous that way. If you have food in a container or storage or something you don't want them to get access to, they'll figure out how to get it.
Oh yeah. What about a trick where she would pick up her keeper in her trunk? What was that trick like? Or how would you train someone?
How would you train that? You would start training them by picking up logs, anything with your trunk and balancing it, being very gentle and careful with it. Judy, come here. And then after that, then you would start to train them to pick yourself up with the log in that same fashion. And obviously by that time, you have enough relationship with them where they don't want to hurt you, so they're going to be very careful about doing it. And then after you have them picking you up and they understand how to do it very carefully, then you could start putting in other people to have them pick it up.
So you and I have been both whacked by Judy's ear during this interview. So are these ears dangerous?
They can be if the elephant is not aware of where you're standing, and it's a little bit harder for her to tell. It's as she's blind, so she doesn't quite know. So it's a
Right where
it's a
we
whole
are.
different thing.
But normally, why are they flapping their ears?
Just to kind of cool themselves down, keep off insects. It'll create a gush of air across her back. It's not very hot now, so she's just mainly doing it to keep insects off, kind of a horse flicking the tail.
In the summer of 1826, Betty was shot and killed right here in downtown Chepachet on this bridge. Now, most of Betty was buried here in this hollow, and the rest of Betty got tanned and stuffed at a tannery that used to be back here. No one knows where stuffed Betty is today. But people here in Chepachet apparently feel really sad about the event, so they try to keep Betty's memory alive. School children have painted Betty's picture for display around town, and Chepachet has this fiberglass elephant, Mr. Potato Head, in front of the town hall. And the bridge, it's known officially in town as Elephant Bridge. So here's a couple more interesting facts about Betty the Learned Elephant. The name of Betty's keeper was Ecological Bailey, and Ecological Bailey was the first American to train an elephant, and that's why Betty was called the Learned Elephant. Now, the Bailey name, that should ring a bell as you start thinking about circuses.
Ringling Brothers and Barnum Bailey Circus.
It's the same family, and Ecological started the whole thing.
Right here in the Blackstone Valley.
That's right.
Well, it's interesting you say that, Dan, because there's a lot of interesting stories in the Blackstone Valley that have a little twist to them. And, you know, one of the best ones is actually about the namesake of the entire valley, William Blackstone. You know, man, we have a river named after him, we have a national park named after him, we used to have a potato chip factory named after the guy, and when push comes to shove, he's a man of mystery. There's a lot of things that we don't know about him, and ironically, we don't even know where he is today.
Well, tell us.
Well, to tell us a little bit more about that story, I think we ought to leave the riverbank here in Uxbridge and maybe go down a little bit closer to where our friend William Blackstone lived, along the river down in Cumberland, Rhode Island.
While talking about the contributions made by the people of the Blackstone Valley to the Second World War, we would be remiss to overlook those made by the namesake of the valley, the Reverend William Blackstone himself. And that might seem a little bit peculiar, seeing as he died about 250 years before the war began, but like many an unsung hero, the Reverend Blackstone literally gave his all to the war effort. Now I'm standing here in the William Blackstone Memorial Park, right next to a monument that reads in part, "The grave of the Reverend William Blackstone." But this stone is lying because Reverend Blackstone isn't buried here. In fact, we don't know where he is buried, and if anyone does know, they're not saying. Now, the Reverend Blackstone was the first English settler in this region, leaving Boston in 1635 and looking for a new place to live. And he arrived in this area, which he named Study Hill, which is now the section of Lonsdale in the town of Cumberland, Rhode Island. And he lived here for about 40 years in what was then a pastoral wilderness, farming and preaching, as well as growing his famous roses and apples. When he died here in 1675, he was buried by his friends along the banks of the river that now bears his name. Blackstone's slumber remained undisturbed for about another 200 years, until in 1886 when the Lonsdale Company decided that they were going to build a new mill here along the banks of the Blackstone River. And this was to be the Ann and Hope Mill, this monstrous 500-foot-long, 4-story brick building that was going to be put right at the base of Study Hill. Now, in order to build it, they were going to have to come in here and flatten out the base of the hill, including digging up William Blackstone's grave. Well, the people of Cumberland decided this was a little bit too much for their founding father, and so they carefully disinterred him. They reburied William Blackstone in about the same spot and put the monument over the top. Now, Blackstone was left again to his own rest for about 60 more years. And then in 1944, during the middle of the war, the Ann and Hope Mill was now being used as a repair facility by the Navy to fix up heavy equipment. And they realized they needed to bring in a new train line so they could ship things up from Providence and Quonset Point right here to the mill. And that new rail was going to go right over the gravesite of William Blackstone. Once again, William Blackstone was going to have to be moved for the cause of progress. At this point, wiser minds prevailed. They realized, well, this is the second time we've had to move this man in less than 60 years. Maybe this is a bit of a high traffic area, not the best spot for him to be buried. So they decided they would pick up the monument, redig William Blackstone up, and rebury him, this time behind the mill, over on Broad Street, where they felt that more people would be able to see the monument. Well, this is where the story gets a little bit confusing, which is often the case when we're dealing with William Blackstone. After they moved the monument, either he was dug up right at that point, or, as some say, it was a little bit after the war when a backhoe came along and accidentally dug up what was left of the box. Well, either way, William Blackstone's remains were picked up and put aside for later reburial. But remember, there's a war on and people had better priorities. And so it was a few years after the war, when they moved the monument over to Broad Street, they decided to rebury William Blackstone. Well, unfortunately, no one could find his earthly remains. Now, some folks tell a story about how they were last seen on a shelf in the manager's office over here in the Ann and Hope Mill. Another story talks about them being seen in a barn somewhere here in Rhode Island. But either way, the remains of William Blackstone, the sage of the wilderness, were gone for good. The mystery remains unsolved to this day. And in 1997, when this new park was created, they moved the monument to this new site, where it continues to falsely proclaim that it is the site of the grave of the Reverend William Blackstone, pioneer, botanist, preacher, and MIA since 1944.
And so, there you go, William Blackstone, man of mystery. After so many years of our research and study and telling stories about this man, there's so much that we don't know. And that's what sort of makes it fun being a ranger, is you're constantly trying to track down new stories to tell. And hopefully, maybe next time we're sitting around the campfire, I'll have a new story to share about the Reverend William Blackstone.
Here, here. We like that. We like that. Boy, Kevin, that's a very appropriate song, Dirty Water. Because, Karen, back in Reverend Blackstone's day, they used the Blackstone River as their water supply. They used it to drink all the time. Do you think we'll ever get back to the point where we could use the Blackstone River as a water supply?
Unfortunately, Chuck, I don't think we will. Because of the heavy industrial use of the Blackstone River, I don't think we're going to get back to that point. But that definitely does not mean we should just give up on the Blackstone River. In fact, our goal, and the goal of many here at the quarter, and I think you guys agree, is that we want to have a swimmable and fishable Blackstone River by 2020. And we're actually making great strides. And here's one way that I can tell.
Many people aren't aware that you can get a sense of the overall health of the river just by looking at some of the critters that live there. Of course, you have to know where to look, and that's part of the river called a riffle, where you have cobble-sized stones and fast-flowing but not too deep water, so you can wade into it. And you have to know what you're looking for. That's a group of creatures called benthic macroinvertebrates, or macros for short. And lastly, you have to know how to find these bugs of the Blackstone. Now, one technique involves picking up and brushing your hands over the stones that the macros attach themselves to, and then allowing the river water to carry the critters into your net. Or you can carefully disturb the bottom of the river where other macros live using a cooking method. Once your sample is collected, you then have the more involved process of sorting and analyzing the macros, and this is where the real information comes from.
Here I'm looking at some of the macros that I found in the Blackstone River. Now, different macros have different tolerance values or sensitivity levels to pollution. Some macros have a low tolerance value, which means that they can only thrive in clean water. So hopefully we'll find some of those, and that would be like a stonefly or a mayfly, so we'll keep our eyes out. Other macros have a higher tolerance value to pollution, and I see some of those here, like this common net-spinning caddisfly. Now, depending on what macros we find in the Blackstone River, that can give us an indication of the overall water quality. Ideally, we want to find macros from a diverse group of tolerance values, covering that whole spectrum. And then we know that we have pretty good water quality, and we're well on our way to that fishable and swimmable Blackstone River.
Alright, so next time I go down to the river to do some macro sampling, I don't want you guys to think that I'm just down there playing. I'm actually doing science.
Oh, science!
Ah, that's what they
Never
call
knew.
it. Yeah.
Well, listen, we got another story for you. This is one you probably haven't heard, and it's much more recent. It's about Austin T. Levy, a mill owner in Harrisville, Rhode Island, and how he saved the the burgers for the Duke of Windsor. The Duke of Windsor. So, Suzanne, how did you learn the story coming back from Bahamas?
Well, Chuck, you know, I really didn't get to go to the Bahamas. I did requisition the request, but it just didn't fly. But I did go in my mind. And boy, what a trip it was. Because do I have a great twist on this story for you. How often do we tell the story of farm to factory here in the Blackstone Valley?
All the time.
We tell it every day. But do I have a new twist on this one? I'm talking burgers to the Bahamas from Burrillville. Factory to farm.
Whoa.
Hi, this is Ranger Buchanan. When I usually go to the beach, I crave for clam cakes and chowder. But the Duke of Windsor, he craved burgers. Here's the connection from Burrillville to the Bahamas, all for a burger. You see, in 1915, Austin T. Levy and his wife June first traveled to the Bahama Islands, the island of Eleuthera, where there he could see the possibilities of farming, of setting up an area to provide a whole new economic growth on the island and new resources.
His experimental farming changed the living conditions and standards of the island's economy. In 1936, after years of careful study and planning, Levy purchased his first Bahama holdings, a 2,000-acre tract on Hatchet Bay. From the start grew the enterprise that made the Harrisville manufacturer a pioneer in the island's economic growth. Levy first introduced modern machinery that was used to improve the island's scanty soil. Then followed dairy herds sent from Harrisville's own Sherman Stock Farm, and later his flocks of Rhode Island red hens followed. While establishing the plantation, he met the Duke of Windsor, then governor of the Bahama Islands. The Duke expressed his love of eating burgers, and thus the Burrillville Burger Connection was born. Levy invited him to visit Burrillville, which the Duke did in 1944. The Duke toured the Stillwater Mill, the assembly, and local sites that Levy had built for his beloved hometown. Levy's project was a catalyst, leading to change in the island from a struggling colony dependent upon tourists to a thriving zone of largely self-supporting residents. All this was made possible by Austin T. Levy.
Well, my ranger friends, now that I've made the connection of burgers in the Bahamas from Burrillville, what do you say? Anybody hungry?
Oh, yeah, let's take one. Suzanne, get one.
Oh, sure.
I want this one.
Absolutely.
Here you go, Kevin, Dan, Jack. Oh, yeah.
Cheers.
Any plain ones? Oh, a plain one. How about you, Jack?
Oh, it's really plain. Another interesting story about the valley has to do with the various immigrant groups, and we're going to focus on the Irish, because the Irish came here and they built the Blackstone Canal. But they also ended up being the center of a major controversy as to where the canal would actually terminate. So Jack, why don't you tell us a little bit about that piece of the story?
Okay. You guys all know that one of the most important factors in the social history of the valley was the mix of ethnic groups over the years. Well, that didn't come easily. Sometimes there was some friction involved here. But the story I want to tell is about a much larger group that came and stayed. This would be the Irish that came to build the canal. Now, back in 1824 to 26, they built most of the southern part of the canal, and the Worcester section began in 1826. And the good people of Worcester all of a sudden had the vision of these rough, tough Irish navvies, as they were called, laborers, coming into their city and creating a pocket of papism, Catholicism. So they decided to petition to keep them out. Well, the builders of the canal had an answer for that. They said, okay, you want the canal to end in Millbury and not in Worcester? It would have been cheaper, really. They would have saved about the 8 locks they had to construct there in Millbury. So all of a sudden, the merchants and the politicians of Worcester began to think, well, maybe we'll let them in for a while. Levi Lincoln said that they're coming here not to live, but to dig the canal, assuming they wouldn't stay. But these guys were not just itinerant laborers. They were trained canal diggers. They were construction people. They came, some of them from England, where they had dug canals. They came down from the Erie Canal, where they dug the center section of that. They were pros at this. When they came, they built the canal. But as the city began to prosper and other things were built, warehouses, docks, roads, turnpikes, these Irish laborers stayed, raised families. They built a church, the first Catholic church west of Boston. They started a college, the first Catholic college in New England, Holy Cross. And what was going on here was a change in the ethnic mix of the valley. It wasn't easy. The Irish were not accepted, as they weren't in many places.
Good story, Jack. You know, there's one of those stories that I have come across in the valley, it just won't let me go. It's one of those stories that is both poignant and powerful, and it has to do with the War of the Rebellion, the Civil War here in the Blackstone Valley. And it has to do with Abraham Lincoln, a young man who was killed in the city of Worcester, and a poem. We're here at the Worcester Historical Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts, an ideal place to tell the tragic story of Lieutenant Willie Grout and the events of October 21st, 1861, the Battle of Ball's Bluff. The nation was at war, and President Lincoln had called upon the young men of the nation to step forward and put down the rebellion. And the men of Worcester County stepped forward. They created the 15th Regiment of Volunteers, made up of all the communities of Worcester County. And in that group was a gentleman by the name of Willie Grout. He had just turned 18. He was probably one of the youngest officers, but already he was marked as being someone special. He had those leadership qualities that men respond to and men follow. They left Worcester in August of 1861, arriving on August 10th in Washington, D.C. And they were assigned to Poolesville, Maryland, where they were to guard a ferry crossing in the Potomac River. Now, the Battle of Ball's Bluff never was supposed to be a battle. Early reconnaissance said there was no troops on the other side of the river. And so they'd sent some Union pickets across, followed by the main body. And they came upon the rebels in force, well fortified. Well, these green but valiant troops suffered heavy casualties. They only had 2 boats to get them back across the river. And Confederate sharpshooters picked off those swimmers one by one. One of them was young Lieutenant Grout. His body washed up against the pontoon bridges in downtown Washington 2 weeks later. Even before President Lincoln declared in 1863 a national day of Thanksgiving, many states in the Northeast were already celebrating such a day. It was November of 1861, and young Willie Grout's body was returned to his parents. And they were having a dinner, a Thanksgiving dinner. And they had a good friend there, Henry Washburn. And Henry Washburn had written a poem to help console the family and help the family grieve and endure its loss. He had signed it very simply HSW. And 2 days later it was printed in the Massachusetts Spy. American composer George Root in Chicago came across the words, was so taken by the power of the lyrics, that he added a melody and created probably one of the most powerful ballads of the entire Civil War. Listen to our friends Pendragon as we recreate this time and his sense of loss.
Eager to caress him while we breathe our evening prayer. When a year ago we gathered, joy was in his mild blue eye, but a golden cord is severed, and our hopes in ruin lie. We shall meet, but we shall miss him. There will be one vacant chair. We shall linger to caress him when we breathe our evening prayer.
Well, there you have it, folks, and we've just barely scratched the surface of the wonderful stories that make up the Blackstone Valley and America. So next time you see a bunch of rangers sitting around a campfire, come on over, sit down, share some of your wonderful stories with us, because we love to hear new stories. And there's no better place to hear a good story than by a campfire in the Blackstone Valley.